October 26, 1944. The Philippine Sea is calm again. Oil drifts across the water in long black ribbons. Twisted steel breaks the surface, then sinks. The smoke has thinned, but the smell of fuel and burned paint still hangs in the air. Scattered Japanese survivors cling to debris, staring at an empty horizon where their fleet once maneuvered in disciplined formations. The Battle of Leyte Gulf is over. It was the largest naval engagement in history, measured not only in ships and aircraft, but in the weight of everything behind them. Battleships lie on the seabed, aircraft carriers burn out of sight. Thousands of trained sailors and aviators are gone, with no replacements waiting. Across the water, American task forces are already regrouping. Damaged ships turn toward repair yards. New carriers steam west from Pearl Harbor. Convoys continue their steady rhythm, untouched, unbroken. For Japan's high command, the defeat is not yet fully calculated. Reports are still arriving, numbers are still being counted. But beneath the formal language of after-action summaries, something deeper is taking shape. This was not just a lost battle. It was the moment Japan confronted a truth it could no longer escape, that the war was no longer being decided by courage, doctrine, or sacrifice alone, but by an industrial power beyond its reach. That realization did not arrive suddenly. It had been building for years. By the summer of 1944, the Second World War had entered a new phase. The momentum that once favored the Axis powers had shifted decisively. In Europe, Allied armies were advancing across France after the Normandy landings. In the East, the Red Army was pushing relentlessly toward Germany's borders. Across the Pacific, the war had become a measured, grinding advance, island by island, airfield by airfield. For Japan, the situation was growing increasingly precarious. The empire had expanded rapidly in 1941 and 1942, seizing territory across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. These early victories had delivered vital resources: oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber and tin from Malaya, strategic depth across thousands of miles of ocean. But expansion came with a cost. Japan now had to defend an empire stretched thin across vast distances, connected by vulnerable sea lanes. From the beginning, Japan's war strategy rested on a critical assumption: that the United States lacked the political will and industrial flexibility to sustain a prolonged, casualty-heavy conflict in the Pacific. Japanese planners believed that early sharp blows, Pearl Harbor, the fall of the Philippines, the capture of Singapore, would shock Washington into negotiating a settlement before American strength could be fully mobilized. That assumption would shape every major decision that followed. The Imperial Japanese Navy had long embraced the doctrine of the decisive battle. Rooted in lessons drawn from the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, this theory held that a single, climatic naval engagement could determine the outcome of a war. If Japan could lure the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a decisive confrontation and destroy it, the enemy's ability to continue fighting would collapse. But this doctrine was built for an earlier age. By 1943, the nature of warfare had changed. Aircraft carriers had replaced battleships as the primary instruments of naval power. Submarines, radar, and long-range airstrikes reshaped how fleets found and destroyed one another. Most critically, modern war was no longer sustained by fleets alone, but by factories, shipyards, and supply networks operating far from the front lines. And here, the disparity between Japan and the United States was stark. American industrial mobilization after December 1941 had no historical parallel. Automobile factories were converted to aircraft production. Shipyards worked around the clock, launching vessels at a pace that defied pre-war projections. Liberty ships slid into the water in weeks, not months. Fleet carriers, escort carriers, destroyers, and submarines emerged in numbers that allowed losses to be absorbed without slowing the advance. Japan could not match this output. Its industrial base was smaller, its access to raw materials increasingly threatened by American submarines, and its manufacturing processes less adaptable to mass production. Every lost carrier, every sunk tanker, every trained pilot represented a loss that could not be easily replaced. By 1944, fuel shortages alone restricted training and operational planning across the Japanese Navy. The Air War told the same story. Japan's early war pilots were among the best in the world, hardened by years of combat in China. But the training pipeline that produced them was slow and elite. As losses mounted at Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Solomon Islands, there were no reserves to draw upon. New pilots arrived with fewer flight hours, rushed through abbreviated programs. The United States, by contrast, trained pilots by the tens of thousands. If one carrier air group was destroyed, another could be embarked within weeks. Strategically, Japan's defensive perimeter was already collapsing. The fall of Saipan in July 1944 placed American bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. The loss sent shockwaves through Tokyo, triggering the resignation of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo. For the first time, the possibility of direct attacks on Japan itself became unavoidable. The Philippines now stood at the center of everything. Control of the Philippine archipelago meant control of Japan's sea lanes to the south. Oil from the East Indies flowed through these waters. Lose the Philippines, and the empire would be severed in two. Japanese forces in Southeast Asia would be isolated, starved of fuel and ammunition, unable to influence the war's outcome. For American planners, the logic was equally clear. General Douglas MacArthur had pledged to return. Admiral Chester Nimitz saw the islands as the gateway to the South China Sea and beyond. By mid-1944, an invasion was no longer a question of if, but when. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters understood what was coming. They knew the U.S. fleet would arrive in overwhelming force. They knew their own losses had eroded combat power beyond easy repair. Yet they also believed they had one final chance. One massive gamble, a blow so costly it might still alter the course of the war. That belief would carry Japan toward the waters of Leyte, where doctrine, desperation, and reality would collide. By early autumn 1944, Japanese naval planning had narrowed to a single concept. It was no longer about preserving strength for a prolonged defense. It was about spending what remained in one final, decisive effort. This plan was designated Shō-Gō 1. On paper, it was bold. In practice, it was born of necessity. The Imperial Japanese Navy could no longer challenge American sea control across the Pacific. Fuel shortages limited training and movement. Air groups were under strength. Surface fleets had been depleted by submarine attacks and airstrikes. Yet the Philippines could not be abandoned without severing Japan's access to the resources that sustained the war. Shō-Gō envisioned a complex, multi-pronged operation. Japanese forces would draw U.S. carrier task groups away from the invasion beaches, while heavy surface units, battleships and cruisers moved in to destroy the American transports at Leyte. It relied on coordination across vast distances, precise timing, and the assumption that American commanders could be deceived. The structure of the plan revealed both ingenuity and fragility. Admiral Toyoda Soemu, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, directed the operation from Tokyo. Vice Admiral Kurita Takeo commanded the powerful center force, including the battleships Yamato and Musashi, the largest warships ever built. His fleet would pass through the Sibuyan Sea and San Bernardino Strait, then descend upon Leyte Gulf from the north.
To the south, Vice Admiral Nishimoto Shoji's southern force would attempt to pass through Surigao Strait. Another contingent under Vice Admiral Shima Kiyohide would follow, intended to exploit any breakthrough. Meanwhile, to the north, Vice Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo commanded a decoy carrier force. These carriers carried few aircraft and even fewer trained pilots. Their purpose was not to fight, but to be seen, to lure Admiral William Halsey's powerful Third Fleet away from Leyte and open the path for Kurita's battleships. It was a plan that acknowledged reality without fully accepting it. The Japanese High Command understood that their carrier aviation was no longer capable of contesting air superiority. Ozawa's force was, in effect, a sacrificial formation. The hope was that American doctrine, shaped by earlier carrier battles, would compel Halsey to pursue the carriers at all costs. Across the Pacific, American preparations unfolded on an entirely different scale. The invasion of Leyte was supported by an armada unprecedented in size. Hundreds of transports, escorts, landing ships, and auxiliary vessels assembled under the protection of two massive fleets. Admiral Thomas Kincaid's 7th Fleet supported the landings directly, while Halsey's 3rd Fleet roamed as a mobile striking force. Behind them lay an industrial system that absorbed losses as a matter of routine. Damaged carriers rotated out and returned. Destroyers were replaced almost as quickly as they were lost. Fuel flowed uninterrupted from the American mainland and captured Pacific bases. American intelligence, though imperfect, had grown increasingly effective. Submarine patrols tracked Japanese movements. Radio intercepts revealed patterns, even if not precise intentions. There was no illusion that Japan still possessed hidden reserves equal to those already expended. Yet despite this imbalance, the battle would not be simple. Leyte Gulf's geography favored complexity. Narrow straits, confined seas, and limited visibility offered opportunities for surface action, the very kind of battle Japanese planners still believed could deliver decisive results. If Kurita's battleships could reach the invasion beaches, they could inflict catastrophic damage on unarmored transports and landing craft. On October 20, 1944, American forces went ashore on Leyte. Within days, Japanese fleets began moving from their distant anchorages. Fuel that had been hoarded for months was expended. Ships sailed knowing there might be no return voyage. As they advanced, American submarines struck first, then carrier aircraft followed. The battle began before the main fleets ever sighted one another. By the time the shooting reached its peak, 4 separate engagements would unfold across hundreds of miles of ocean. Each would tell part of the same story. And when it ended, Japan would discover that the problem was not merely that its plan had failed, but that the enemy it faced could lose ships, men, and aircraft at a scale Japan could no longer comprehend. That realization would come not in a single moment, but in the aftermath, as the true balance of power revealed itself in stark, undeniable terms. For the men aboard Japan's ships, Leyte Gulf was not an abstract gamble or a doctrinal exercise. It was cold steel beneath their feet, dimly lit compartments, and orders that carried an unspoken finality. Many sailors understood what this mission represented. Fuel had been rationed for months. Training cruises had been canceled. Ships that once sailed in balanced formations now departed with skeleton crews and worn equipment. When Kurita's center force sorted from Brunei, there were no illusions about the risks ahead. As American submarines struck in the Palawan Passage, the reality of vulnerability became immediate. The heavy cruisers Atago and Maya were sunk within hours. Hundreds of sailors were lost before the main battle even began. Survivors were left drifting as the fleet pressed on, unable to stop. For those who remained, the scale of American air attacks in the Sibuyan Sea shattered any lingering confidence. Waves of carrier aircraft arrived with precision and persistence. The battleship Musashi absorbed hit after hit, torpedoes, bombs, fire spreading uncontrollably until she finally capsized, taking over 1,000 men with her. These were losses Japan could not replace. Each sailor had undergone years of training. Each ship represented a concentration of resources that Japan's economy could no longer reproduce. The men who survived did so knowing that their fleet was shrinking with every hour and that no reinforcements waited beyond the horizon. The human dimension of Leyte Gulf was not only about death, but about absence. The empty bunks, the silent compartments, the realization that entire crews had vanished without the possibility of recovery. This was not just sacrifice, it was depletion. And depletion would shape every decision that followed. The most decisive force at Leyte Gulf never fired a shot. It existed in American shipyards, aircraft factories, and logistics depots thousands of miles from the Philippines. By late 1944, the United States was producing naval power at a rate unmatched by any nation in history. Fleet carriers damaged in combat were repaired and returned to service within weeks. Escort carriers, often dismissed as expendable, were available in numbers that allowed them to absorb losses without operational pause. Destroyers were commissioned faster than Japan could lay keels. Aircraft losses told the same story. American pilots who failed to return were replaced by trained crews arriving continuously from stateside bases. Aircraft shot down over the Sibuyan Sea were replaced by new machines rolling off assembly lines almost immediately. Japanese officers observed this pattern with growing unease. After earlier battles, losses had felt significant but manageable. At Leyte, the contrast became undeniable. Japanese ships burned and sank, while American formations appeared to regenerate. Damage reports showed vessels withdrawing under their own power, escorted, repaired, and returned. The battlefield no longer ended at the horizon. It extended back to Detroit, Seattle, and San Diego, places Japan could not reach, disrupt, or influence. No amount of tactical brilliance at sea could overcome a production gap of that magnitude. By late 1944, industrial capacity had become a form of inevitability. One side could recover from defeat, the other could not. This was not yet openly acknowledged in Tokyo, but among officers tasked with reporting losses, the arithmetic was already clear. Japanese strategy at Leyte was not irrational, it was desperate. The High Command understood that traditional defensive measures were no longer sufficient. Island garrisons were being bypassed, airfields were neutralized before ground forces could react. Submarines were strangling supply lines. Waiting meant watching the empire dissolve piece by piece. Shō-Gō was designed to force a decision. By committing the remaining battleships and cruisers, Japan hoped to inflict a shock so severe that it would alter American momentum. Transport losses at Leyte could delay the campaign, raise casualty figures, and perhaps provoke debate in Washington. But this strategy depended on assumptions that no longer held. It assumed American commanders would act predictably. It assumed American losses would carry the same weight they once did. Most critically, it assumed that Japan and the United States were still operating within the same material limits. They were not. As Japanese forces pressed forward, every sunk ship tightened the noose. Each decision was shaped by the knowledge that there would be no second attempt, no rebuilding, no recovery. Strategy had become a one-time wager. And as the battle unfolded, it became increasingly clear that the outcome would not be determined solely by who fought more skillfully, but who could afford to keep fighting afterward. That realization would deepen as the battle's final movements came into view.
By the time of Leyte Gulf, Japanese naval leadership was operating under constraints unknown in earlier phases of the war. The loss of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto in April 1943 had removed not only a brilliant strategist, but a unifying figure capable of tempering doctrine with realism. His successors inherited a navy already in decline, forced to execute plans shaped more by necessity than conviction. Admiral Toyoda Sawemu, directing operations from Tokyo, was acutely aware of Japan's material weakness. Internal memoranda reflected this understanding. Yet acknowledging the imbalance did not produce alternatives. The fleet could not be preserved for a future that no longer existed. In Toyota's calculus, expending the navy at Leyte was preferable to watching it wither unused. At sea, Vice Admiral Kurita Takeo carried the heaviest burden. Commanding the center force, he watched his flagship sink beneath him in the opening phase of the battle. Forced to transfer command under fire, Kurita pressed on despite mounting losses, knowing that turning back might doom the operation entirely. These were not decisions made lightly. Japanese commanders understood that defeat at Leyte would effectively end the Imperial Navy as an offensive force, but leadership at this stage of the war was about managing decline, not reversing it. There was no illusion of parity left, only duty. Japanese intelligence assessments of American strength lagged behind reality. While Japan tracked ship numbers and major movements, it struggled to grasp the depth of American replacement capacity. Early war assumptions that U.S. society would resist sustained losses continued to influence planning well into 1944. American casualty tolerance, however, was not the limiting factor Japan believed it to be. Losses were absorbed within a system designed for endurance. When a carrier was damaged, another filled the gap. When pilots were lost, training pipelines compensated. Even logistical setbacks were temporary. This asymmetry created a dangerous miscalculation. Japanese planners expected that inflicting sufficient damage at Leyte could stall the American advance. What they did not fully appreciate was that American operations were not paced by individual battles, but by production schedules and logistics timetables. Leyte was not a gamble for the United States, it was a phase. As Japanese after-action reports accumulated, the scale of this misreading became clear. Enemy losses, even when significant, did not translate into strategic pause. The enemy did not slow down. Beyond ships and aircraft, Leyte Gulf inflicted a quieter, deeper wound. For years, Japanese naval doctrine had been sustained by belief in superior training, superior spirit, and the moral strength to overcome material disadvantage. That belief had endured earlier defeats. It had survived Midway, Guadalcanal, in the Solomons. At Leyte, it fractured. Officers who reviewed the battle's outcome saw not just defeat, but inevitability. The loss of Musashi, the annihilation of Southern force at Surigao Strait, the destruction of Ozawa's carriers, each engagement ended the same way. Japan expended irreplaceable assets, the United States absorbed losses and continued forward. This was the moment when confidence shifted into resignation. Not surrender, but recognition. Recognition that the war had entered a stage where valor could no longer compensate for disparity, where sacrifice no longer promised reversal, where the future was defined by endurance Japan did not possess. That psychological shift did not end the war, but it changed how Japan would fight it. The consequences of that realization would soon become visible, first in the battle's decisive moments, and then in the strategies that followed.
The battle began before dawn on October 23, 1944, in the confined waters of the Palawan Passage. American submarines USS Darter and USS Dace had been tracking Kurita's center force as it moved east from Brunei. When the Japanese column entered the narrow channel, there was little room to maneuver. Torpedoes struck with devastating accuracy. The heavy cruisers Atago and Maya were mortally hit. Atago sank rapidly, taking Vice Admiral Kurita's flag with her. Maya followed soon after. A third cruiser, Takao, was crippled and forced to withdraw. Before the surface fleets had exchanged fire, Japan had already suffered irreplaceable losses. Kurita pressed on. On October 24th, the center force entered the Sibuyan Sea. There, it faced the full weight of American carrier aviation. Wave after wave of aircraft descended from Task Force 38. Bombs and torpedoes tore into Japanese formations with methodical precision. The battleship Musashi became the focal point of the assault.
She absorbed more than a dozen torpedo hits and numerous bomb strikes over several hours. Despite her size and armor, physics prevailed. By evening, Musashi rolled and sank, her passing marked by silence rather than spectacle. Over 1,000 sailors went down with her. Kurita briefly reversed course, leading American commanders to believe the threat had been neutralized, but under cover of darkness, he turned back toward San Bernardino Strait. To the south, Japanese forces met an even harsher fate. In the early hours of October 25th, Vice Admiral Nishimura's southern force attempted to transit Surigao Strait. Waiting for them was an American force executing a textbook maneuver, crossing the T. Battleships, once damaged at Pearl Harbor, now fired radar-directed salvos into the darkness. Japanese ships were illuminated by searchlights and gunfire. Within hours, Nishimura's force was annihilated. Few survivors escaped the strait. Further north, Ozawa's Decoy carriers succeeded in drawing Admiral Halsey away from Leyte. Believing the enemy carrier force to be the primary threat, Halsey took the Third Fleet north, leaving San Bernardino Strait unguarded. It was a moment of opportunity born from sacrifice. Kurita emerged into the Philippine Sea and encountered American escort carriers and destroyers off Samar. What followed was one of the most desperate surface actions in naval history. Outgunned American ships charged battleships and cruisers, laying smoke, launching torpedoes, buying time with courage and improvisation. Yet even here, the larger pattern asserted itself. American aircraft continued to attack regardless of losses. Confusion spread through Japanese ranks. Kurita, uncertain of the broader situation and facing persistent air attacks, ultimately ordered a withdrawal. By midday on October 25th, the last realistic chance for Japan to alter the course of the war had slipped away. But the full meaning of what had happened was only beginning to settle in.
In the hours after the fighting subsided, the battlefield offered no sense of triumph, only evidence. Japanese ships scattered across hundreds of miles of ocean, many damaged, some barely operational, others simply gone. Communications were fragmented. Reports arrived late, incomplete, often contradictory. Commanders struggled to assemble a coherent picture of what had survived and what had been lost. But as the fragments came together, a pattern emerged that could not be explained away. 4 Japanese carriers lay sunk. 3 battleships, including Musashi, were gone. 10 cruisers had been destroyed. Hundreds of aircraft were lost, many flown by pilots whose training had already been abbreviated by necessity. Entire formations had ceased to exist in less than 3 days of combat. Yet across the radio traffic, American forces continued to maneuver with confidence. New task groups appeared. Damaged carriers withdrew in orderly fashion, already scheduled for repair. Escort carriers resumed operations within days. Transport convoys at Leyte continued unloading men and equipment, largely uninterrupted by the surface action that had been meant to annihilate them. For Japanese officers reviewing the situation, the realization was unavoidable. They had thrown everything into the battle, and the enemy had barely paused. Internal assessments began to reflect this shift in understanding. Loss ratios were no longer evaluated in isolation. What mattered was replacement capacity, and here the imbalance was overwhelming. Where Japan had lost ships representing years of construction and training, the United States replaced damage with routine efficiency. One Japanese naval staff officer later noted that American losses, which would once have been decisive, now registered as temporary inconveniences. The war had reached a stage where Japan could no longer influence outcomes through concentrated effort alone. Even the psychological weapons had lost their force. The destruction of Ozawa's carriers had been anticipated. Their sacrifice had succeeded tactically, but strategically it revealed the emptiness of Japan's remaining hand. A navy built around carriers without aircraft, pilots without hours, ships without fuel, could no longer impose its will. Kurita's decision to withdraw from off Samar would later be debated, criticized, defended, but by the time it was made, the larger outcome was already sealed. Even had he pressed on, there was no mechanism left to sustain success. This was not simply defeat in battle, it was exposure. Exposure to a reality that Japan's leadership had delayed confronting, that modern war was no longer decided by singular moments of heroism or doctrine, but by systems of production, logistics, and recovery operating beyond the reach of the battlefield. Leyte Gulf made that reality visible. From that point forward, Japanese strategy would reflect not how to win the war, but how to endure its inevitable conclusion. That shift would define everything that followed.
In the days following the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Japanese Navy attempted to take inventory of what remained. The effort itself underscored the scale of the loss. Ships were missing without confirmation. Units failed to report. Command structures that had once coordinated fleet-wide operations now struggled to account for individual vessels. The numbers, when finally assembled, were stark. Japan had lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. More than 10,000 sailors and airmen were dead. Many of the survivors were wounded, exhausted, or stranded far from operational bases. Fuel reserves had been expended in quantities that could not be replaced. What remained of the combined fleet was no longer capable of coordinated offensive action. The defeat was not publicly acknowledged in full. Official statements emphasized valor and sacrifice, framing the battle as a costly but honorable struggle. Yet within naval headquarters, there was no ambiguity. Leyte Gulf marked the end of Japan as a major naval power. American losses, by contrast, were severe but manageable. A small number of escort carriers and destroyers were sunk. Aircraft losses were quickly replenished. Within weeks, U.S. naval strength in the Pacific was greater than it had been before the battle. The invasion of Leyte continued uninterrupted. Troops, vehicles, artillery, and supplies poured ashore in an unbroken stream. Airfields expanded. Logistics hubs multiplied. The Philippines, once lost in the early months of the war, were now firmly within American control. For Japan, the strategic consequences were immediate and irreversible. The loss of the Philippines severed the empire's southern lifeline. Oil shipments from the Dutch East Indies could no longer reach the home islands in meaningful quantities. Southeast Asian garrisons were isolated, left to fight without hope of resupply or reinforcement. Naval doctrine, long centered on decisive fleet engagements, became obsolete overnight. There were no fleets left to gamble. In the vacuum left by this collapse, new ideas took hold. With conventional options exhausted, Japanese planners began turning toward measures that reflected not confidence, but resignation. Special attack units, kamikaze forces, had already appeared at Leyte. Now they would expand, becoming central rather than supplemental. This shift was not presented as desperation, it was framed as necessity. Yet beneath the rhetoric, the truth was widely understood. Japan could no longer fight the war it had prepared for. It was now fighting a different war entirely, one shaped by scarcity, isolation, and the knowledge that time itself had become the enemy. That understanding would only deepen as the months passed. As the winter of 1944 set in, the consequences of Leyte Gulf spread outward through every level of Japanese military planning. What had been lost could not be rebuilt. What remained could no longer be used in the ways doctrine demanded. The Imperial Japanese Navy retreated to its anchorages, not to regroup, but to survive. Battleships that once symbolized national power now lay idle, immobilized by fuel shortages. Training exercises ceased almost entirely. New ships under construction slowed or stopped as material shortages worsened and American air attacks intensified. strategic initiative passed completely to the United States. American forces advanced northward through the Philippines, then toward Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Each operation was supported by fleets larger than the last. Losses were anticipated, planned for, and absorbed. The tempo of operations did not slacken. Inside Japan, assessments became increasingly candid. Naval officers acknowledged that the United States was producing ships and aircraft faster than Japan could destroy them. Army planners recognized that even successful defensive battles merely delayed the inevitable. Intelligence reports emphasized American logistical depth as the decisive factor in the war's outcome. It was in this environment that kamikaze tactics expanded. Initially conceived as an emergency measure, special attack units became institutionalized after Leyte. They required minimal fuel, limited training, and promised disproportionate damage, at least in theory. More importantly, they aligned with a psychological need to reclaim agency in a war slipping beyond control. Yet even these attacks revealed the same imbalance. American ships absorbed damage and returned to service. New vessels replaced those sunk. The system endured. For Japanese leadership, the realization that had begun at Leyte hardened into certainty. The war could no longer be won through maneuver or mass. It could only be prolonged through sacrifice, with the hope of influencing post-war terms or exhausting the enemy's will. But the enemy's will was sustained by something Japan could not attack. Factories continued to operate. Shipyards launched hulls in steady rhythm. Training bases graduated pilots faster than losses accumulated. The industrial foundation of American power remained intact, distant, untouchable. Leyte Gulf had stripped away illusion. From that point forward, Japanese strategy was no longer about shaping the battlefield. It was about enduring it, about imposing costs where possible, delaying where feasible, and preserving national cohesion in the face of an outcome increasingly understood as unavoidable. The war would continue for many months. The fighting would grow more brutal. Casualties would rise on both sides. But the moment Japan realized it could not outproduce, outlast, or outmaneuver its enemy had already passed. That moment had occurred in the waters off Leyte, and its meaning would echo far beyond the final shots of the battle.
The Battle of Leyte Gulf did not end the war in the Pacific. The fighting that followed would be among the bloodiest of the entire conflict. But Leyte marked the point at which the outcome ceased to be uncertain. For Japan, the battle exposed a truth that could no longer be deferred. Courage, discipline, and sacrifice, qualities that had sustained the Imperial Navy through earlier victories and defeats, were no longer sufficient. Modern war had evolved beyond singular moments of decision. It had become a contest of systems. At Leyte, those systems collided. On one side stood a navy fighting at the limits of its material existence, committing its final reserves in a single, irreversible gamble. On the other stood a fleet supported by an industrial foundation capable of absorbing loss without pause, of replacing destruction as a matter of routine. The realization that followed was not sudden, nor was it publicly declared. It unfolded quietly, through loss reports, repair schedules, and the absence of replacements. It shaped decisions that would define the war's final year, not how to win, but how to endure. In this sense, Leyte Gulf was not merely a naval battle, it was a revelation. It demonstrated that the decisive weapon of the 20th century was not a ship or an aircraft, but the capacity to sustain war over time, to build, repair, train, and replace at a scale beyond the reach of any single engagement. When the waters off the Philippines finally grew still, the wreckage told only part of the story. The larger truth lay beyond the horizon, in shipyards that never slept, and supply lines that never broke. From that moment on, the fate of the Pacific War was no longer being debated, it was being manufactured.